Frydenberg, thanks so much for joining us and To The Point.
Nice to be with you, KK. I see you've started verbling me already. Looking forward to it.
Well, just don't feel the way that this man, David Lionhelm, felt when I was doing an interview with him. I spoke to him just the other week and he had some harsh words to say about yours truly. Let's just have a look and you can tell us what you think. They're going to bring it up in a moment. It's not far off.
I'm going to come and kill you, Peter Van Onselen. I know where you live. I have tried to break into your house before. I have threatened other people.
So try to stay a little more civil than that if you can for us, Josh Frydenberg. Quick reminder, that's out of context. We need to, I think, give that disclaimer every time. All right, let's move into the serious stuff, Minister.
Indeed.
Craig Kelly, he says he's got the champagne on ice when it comes to waiting for Donald Trump to withdraw the US from the Paris Accord. He is your chair of committee around energy and the environment. Do you share his views?
No, I don't. And the Turnbull government is fully committed to the Paris Agreement. Indeed...
You're going to revoke his committee chairmanship?
No, I work very closely and well with Craig Kelly. But I do point out to you, Peter, that the Turnbull government announced the ratification of the Paris Agreement just the day after Donald Trump was elected. So it was a pretty significant statement by our government. And just as we beat our first Kyoto target by 128 million tonnes, and just as we're on track to beat our 2020 target by 224 million tonnes, we will beat our 2030 target, which is a 26 to 28% reduction on 2005 levels by 2030.
Minister, you recently met with Scott Pruitt, that's the head of the Environmental Protection Agency in the United States, when you visited Washington. What did you say to him about Australia's view as to whether or not the US should stay in? He's now briefing Donald Trump about what the US should do and what will be announced tomorrow.
Yeah, I had a very good meeting with Scott Pruitt, and indeed it was dominated by talking about how we can streamline environmental approvals and how we can ensure that there is economic development and environmental protections at the same time. When it came to discussing the Paris Agreement, I made clear, as I've said publicly repeatedly since, that the Turnbull government's position is that we remain committed to the Paris Agreement and we're on track to meet our targets. As to what the Trump administration does, that is a matter for them and their domestic policy choices.
Sure, but if, as expected, Mr Trump does pull out of Paris, does that mean that you failed to convince Mr Pruitt of the merits of staying in?
I think there are a lot more influential people than me.
Well, clearly, if they pull out, if you were trying to tell them to stay in.
I made clear what Australia's position was, and as we have all said repeatedly, the decisions of the Trump administration are for them and them only, and not for us.
But it's happened before, though, not just in environmental treaties, but across other treaties, where if the US pulls out, Australia ultimately pulls out as well. Are you confident that that's not going to be the way this goes?
Look, I'm absolutely convinced and certain that Australia is committed fully to the Paris Agreement, and we see it as important to transition to a lower emissions economy, but we want to do so in the most cost-effective way, Peter, in a way that ensures energy security and stability and energy affordability, knowing how price-sensitive people are to higher electricity bills and how it does impact on our international competitiveness. That's why we tasked Australia's chief scientist, Alan Finkel, through the COAG process to produce a blueprint for reform to our energy market, and next Friday he'll be providing that report to the Prime Minister, to the Premiers and the Chief Ministers.
Let me ask you about that Finkel report. As you pointed out, you're likely to get it next Friday. You made a major announcement this week about carbon capture and storage, that you want to change the laws so that the Clean Energy Finance Corporation can invest in it. Would it perhaps have been prudent to wait till you had the Finkel report so you could say to the opposition, you could say to the crossbench, look, this is part of a bigger package that Alan Finkel's putting forward?
It's a fair point.
Well, actually, there is a stronger point here, which is that Alan Finkel's position on carbon capture and storage is well known. He has said that it's a valid and effective means of emissions reduction. So too has the CSIRO. And after our announcement, major employers in this country, like BHP, like Shell, like the biggest manufacturer, BlueScope Steel, all welcomed the government's announcement. So too did the Energy Networks Australia, which represents 27 different energy networks, and a range of other key stakeholders like community groups like the Committee for Gippsland. They all recognise that carbon capture and storage is being applied internationally. There are 7 large-scale projects already underway around the world, and that it can be used not just for thermal generation plants, namely coal and gas, but also for emissions-intensive industrial processes like steel making, like chemical manufacturing, like gas processing, and that's what we are looking to do.
Why would those carbon-intensive industries, the ones you've just listed there, what incentive do they have to invest in carbon capture and storage in the absence of any type of price signal on carbon or any reward in reducing their emissions?
Well, companies like BHP and BlueScope are good citizens. And
so they do it out of the goodness of their heart?
Well, they're determined to get greater efficiencies into their operations, and if they can capture that carbon, then that will go towards that end. And I point out, Kristina, that the Chevron-led Gorgon project off the coast of Western Australia has a major carbon capture and storage facility, which hopefully will be online pretty soon. And that will be able to sequester into geological formations up to 3 to 4 million tonnes of CO2 a year. So this is very important technology. I visited myself the Petronova plant, which is a coal-fired generation plant in Texas just a few weeks ago, where a 240 megawatt unit had carbon capture and storage. And the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC and the IEA, say you cannot meet the Paris targets without effective use of carbon capture and storage. And so that is why the Labor Party should stick to its previous line in support of CCS, abandon that political fix that they did with the Greens back in 2011 and support the government's amendments.
They do make the point, though, that the Clean Energy Finance Corporation requires under its edict that a commercial return is received, and that carbon capture and storage doesn't necessarily provide for that.
Well, I believe that you can get commercial returns, and what I saw, for example, in the US was that the captured carbon was being used to enhance oil recovery in a nearby field. And so the Obama administration had put something like $190 million into that Petronova plant in Texas, but also a lot of private money had come in, and the combination of that funding, Peter, had been very effective in ensuring that this project got up and running.
The other issue is, how do you provide efficiencies by capturing carbon?
Well, ultimately, it doesn't go up into the air and it doesn't ruin the environment.
That's if it works, though. I mean, I've seen
of...
reports about full rollouts of this in Germany and elsewhere suggest that it does continue to spew out even though they're trying to capture it.
No, I mean, like I say, I visited one of these plants myself in Texas, which was working effectively, 240 megawatt unit. In that case, it was reducing emissions by 40%. Other cases, it can reduce emissions by up to 90%, and that's why companies like BHP are heavily invested in it. That's why in Australia we have, down in the Otways in Victoria, a demonstration project that has been successful in sequestering 80,000 tonnes of carbon.
But Minister, can I just jump in?
What's
the actual... Like, what return is there for the investment that the company has to make? That's really the question. What's the return?
Well, in the case of the project in Texas, the benefits that were achieved by enhancing oil recovery, because the CO2, Peter, was actually used to get the oil out of the field, actually provided significant financial uplift to that company in question. So it can have a commercial return, in those cases. In other cases, it's being used in industrial processes. So, I mean, the fact is, it works 17 places around the world today. That will increase. In Australia, we'll have one of the largest.
Yeah, but if there's no price
off the coast of
incentive
Western
for companies to reduce their carbon, why would they bother to do it? I mean, that's the whole problem, isn't it?
You can go and ask Gorgon or the Chevron. They're doing it off the coast of Western Australia as we speak. You could go and ask the owners of the Petronova plant. I mean, there are benefits to be gained by parties that are using this CCS technology, and the fact is the IEA and the IPCC have both called for its use. So anybody who's interested in lower emissions should support a technology-neutral approach through the application of this CCS and avoid the ideological approach that we've seen from the Greens and increasingly from the Labor Party.
Minister, can I also ask you about this limited merits review? Many Australians wouldn't realise that this can affect their power bills, but of course it can. You've got an opinion piece in today's News Corp papers arguing that the governments in New South Wales and Queensland need to get behind abolishing this limited merits review. Explain what this is to the viewers and how it actually affects their power prices.
Well, absolutely. Well, 50% of a household electricity bill goes to poles and wires. And so that's the transmission and the distribution assets. Now, they are regulated assets, so every 5 years they go to the Australian Energy Regulator, which sits within the ACCC, and they say that the cost of our capital, the cost of rolling out these services will cost X. And the AER will pass a determination on that. In the case of New South Wales, the AER did not give those network companies as much as they asked for. The network companies then appealed to the Competition Tribunal and won, and got an extra $3 billion, and then that was upheld by the Federal Court just last week. So today in New South Wales, the customers and the households will be paying up to $100 each extra a year as a result of this determination. So what I've said to the other energy ministers at COAG is that we should get rid of the limited merits review. It doesn't exist in the telecommunications space. It doesn't exist in the water space or in the air services space. Why should it exist with the already well remunerated network companies? Now, the problem is that all states have to agree. I was supported by Victoria and South Australia, and I was not supported by Queensland and New South Wales. And my view is that those states, Queensland and New South Wales, are conflicted because they own some of the networks, and they are getting the benefit of those networks making higher profits at the expense of consumers. So again, I call upon New South Wales to put consumers first, so too with Queensland, and let's get rid of the limited merits review process.
Just on a completely other topic, if I can, Minister, outside your portfolio, you used to work before going into Parliament for Deutsche Bank. Why is the government letting big overseas banks get away with not having to pay the bank levy?
Oh, look, we've made very clear that this bank levy is a proportionate response to dealing with the issue that we have, which is budget repair. As you know, the banks are highly profitable, but they also benefit.
But so are big banks like
from the
Deutsche Bank.
guarantee.
Why are all these banks allowed to get away with not being included?
Well, these banks are also have a lot of loans that are effectively secured by the government, and we saw that come into effect with the global financial crisis. So, Peter, I think while the Labor Party will kick and scream about it, they've announced that they will support it. I think it's an important measure. It's part of budget repair. It's one of the more difficult decisions we've had to take, so too with the Medicare levy, but it's important to completely fund the NDIS. The real question should be for the Labor Party, why won't they get on board with our NDIS or the Medicare levy to fund the NDIS, and why won't they support our other savings measures which are critical to pay back the debt that they bequeathed to the Australian people?
But just quickly on this idea that the bank guarantee only applies to the big banks and not the smaller banks, does that mean that your government would seriously let Bank of Queensland go under in a GFC Mark II rather than actually guarantee it like the big banks have a guarantee? Would you do that to Queensland?
Look, as you know, those smaller banks have a higher cost of borrowing than the bigger banks. That's the reality. And this
But not if you
will actually
guaranteed
help.
it. Why won't you guarantee the Bank of Queensland? The people of Queensland have a right to that, surely.
No. We guarantee those assets that those banks have. But the point about this levy is it is applying only to the big banks, and they have a lower cost of capital, dare I say it, than some of the smaller banks. And as you know, this levy's been welcomed by some of the smaller banks who will be beneficiaries, like the Bendigo Bank and others. And a more level playing field in the banking industry is not a bad thing.
All right, Minister, that's all the time we've got. Thanks so much for coming on To The Point.
Appreciate your company.
Good to see you, Kristina. Good to see you, Peter.
He's always a good sport, Josh
He
Frydenberg.
is. I thought he did a really good job there, but I'm not sure he cleared up that EIS issue.
Well, in fairness, we didn't ask him about it.
In fairness, he did clear it up on Monday.
We've only been teasing. We've only been teasing.
We know.
Do you think he's a genuine leadership option this term of Parliament if Malcolm Turnbull stays where he is, or down the track?
You really are now having.
Well, no, because he's one of the next generation
There's
who's
nothing
touted
worse
to be in
than
the
putting
leadership.
that target on someone's back, mate.
I'm not putting the target on his back. I'm praising him as a leadership option.
Oh yeah, that's the kind of praise that aspiring leaders can do without.
All right.
He
is. It's
How
him
well
and
did he-
Christian Porter,
how well did
maybe
he
with
handle
Angus
that?
Taylor in Generation Next.
Okay. All right, you heard it here first and To The Point. Now let's go to